Okay, Matt, so let's go on now, and could you sort of say a little bit about what you want to talk about first, and then go through it with us. Thanks very much.
Okay, well today, John, I'd like to talk about the idea of product service systems, and I've been looking at these things for some time. I studied them in my PhD in 1999 to 2000. And they're a solution which has been developed to environmental problems, and whether they actually turn out to be, have turned out or will turn out to be a solution actually is debatable, and that debate in itself is interesting, and I'd like to touch upon that in our discussion.
Great.
Product service systems basically are services, and when we think about improving environmental performance through eco-design or environmental innovation, most of that work has actually focused on products, things we can touch. It has been concerned with changing materials, for example, in a computer, reducing the amount of materials we may need, to reducing the amount of energy which may be needed to boil a kettle, or the amount of energy which may have been required to run a computer or other pieces of electrical or electronic equipment. But actually there's been a growing interest in service innovation, and the focus on service innovation has been product service systems, collections of products and services which have been combined by designers and innovators to produce functionality, to produce service. Basically, the design or innovation strategy involves considering a product, like for example an answer phone, and thinking, well actually what functionality does that really provide to a household? Well, it takes messages and it answers the phone for you, and you can come along later and you can recall those messages. Well, that functionality could be met in another way, and the most obvious way, and the way that lots of people will be familiar with actually, is voicemail. And there we have a central answer phone which records messages and allows us to play them back when we get home from being out or whatever. And there, one of the great things from the environmental perspective, in terms of environmental performance, is that one answer phone, one piece of equipment, replaces many, because we don't need lots of answer phones in the home if we use voicemail, for example.
Much more resource efficient, as the jargon goes.
Much more resource efficient, or very simply put, we can do much more with less. We can do more with less. So one product replaces many products potentially.
And people don't have to actually own the thing, but they have easy access to what it does for you.
That's right. The focus is on use value or on functionality. It's not actually on having to own the thing. We can actually rely upon a voicemail service, which really is pretty reliable and provided by a whole host of firms. One of the nice things about this strategy, about this approach, is the fact that these things are going on anyway. And I'm a great believer in, when dealing with environmental problems, that actually we can do it through incremental change, and that we can build, we can do quite a bit, perhaps not everything through incremental change, but we can do a lot through incremental change by building on emerging trends, things that are going on in the economy anyway, changes in production and consumption. And we know that when we pick up lots of newspapers and when we read various things, that we often classify Western economies as service economies, and there's generally a tendency to purchase and produce and consume more and more services. So the question then becomes, what opportunities does that create to improve environmental performance? And the idea of thinking about functionality of products and replacing these with services, or actually complementing products with services in some way to improve environmental performance, is one solution which has been proposed around the idea of product service systems. Now, a lot of this research began to take off in the late 1990s, and there were several reports which were produced which said that a shift from product to service would improve environmental performance significantly. Subsequently, we have undertaken research, and we find that Perhaps the improvements in environmental performance aren't as significant as we originally thought, because in some instances we thought we could get as much as factor 20 improvements in resource efficiency, whereas now we think actually the strategy may yield lower improvements in environmental performance. But I don't think that that means that we necessarily have to say that this solution or this approach is invalid. Rather, we may think of product service systems and a service design approach to be part of the mix of activities, the mix of design and innovation that we undertake as part of our journey away from unsustainability and towards sustainability to improve environmental performance. And that's one of the things that we can learn from considering this solution, that while it is not a silver bullet, it is not the thing which is necessarily going to entirely resolve the environmental problem. And indeed I think that it's very difficult to think that one thing, one idea will actually do that. Rather, I think it's a collection of ideas, a mix of designs and innovations which are needed to help move society onto a more sustainable footing.
And I guess, for some products, if you like, or things, it's much more, it has a much bigger effect than for others. I mean, like the answer phone seems to have a huge effect, really.
The answer phone may have a really big effect, but there are different classifications of product service systems. The first type is a product-orientated product service system. That's basically where, if you go along to many shops, you buy a white good such as a washing machine, and you can often buy an extended warranty with that. And that means basically that item is likely to be repaired over the next 5 to 7 years, and that actually that machine will stay in use for that time period. So the idea of wasting resources in its manufacture and it potentially with early disposal actually isn't so much of a problem there. The second type of product service system is use-orientated, and there are lots of examples of these. These are sharing schemes or renting or leasing schemes, and there's lots of opportunities to share resources such as even garden tools, and to lease cars and to rent cars on short-term contracts, and car clubs and bike clubs, and that's a very popular approach. The thing with both product and use-orientated product service systems, it's a bit of a mouthful in the jargon, lots of products, lots of services, is that they offer gains in environmental performance, but not quite as great as result-orientated product service system, which is the third classification. And that actually is when we review a product and we think about functionality and replace it entirely with a service. We just focus on what functionality does a customer need, and we provide for that functionality. And if we look in business-to-business markets, there are a number of examples where, for example, products are not sold, but services are consumed instead, because it's actually the outputs which are required. And if we do that, potentially manufacturers can bring to bear their competencies to select the right product for the job, and they also own it over the life cycle of the product and maintain it, and also have responsibility for disposal. So the potential environmental gains from that approach are really quite high. But, excuse me, of course for a household, owning things actually is often really important, because when we own things we get a sense of welfare because they're in our control, and we have them in the household, and if something goes wrong in the family and we need to do some washing, I need my washing machine to be there. I can't necessarily rely upon a service which may or may not, with the best will in the world, turn up. And so that's risky, and so there's a relationship between ownership and welfare. So one of the big barriers to this approach is actually the idea of product ownership rather than buying service is very deeply embedded, I think, in our culture and our ideas of welfare and how we might live.